Water rippled around her as she clutched her arms across her chest, half hidden among the reeds, her hair streaming like black fire against the sunlight, and shame burned hotter than the cold water biting her skin. From the shore came cruel laughter, 3 town men waving the bright scraps of her dress high above their heads, like a trophy, their boots thudding on the rocks as they jeered at her helplessness. "Swim for it, Apache girl," one shouted, and another hurled her torn sash into the dust, their voices echoing across the clear blue lake. As though the whole valley had turned to mock her, she pressed herself deeper into the water, teeth chattering not from cold but from fury, and then she saw him alone. Rider cresting the hill, his horse dark against the blazing sky, a cowboy whose shadow stretched long as he slowed at the edge of the shore. Desperation clawed at her throat, pride warring with terror, but her voice broke free, raw and pleading. "They stole my clothes, cowboy, save me." The words cracked across the water, silencing even the jeers for an instant. His gaze swept the scene, the men sneering on the bank, the woman, half drowned in humiliation. And without hesitation, he swung down from the saddle, his boot striking the earth like a challenge. The nearest man barked a laugh. "What is it to you, stranger? Just an Indian girl." "No more than a game." The cowboy slid his hand deliberately to the coat slung over his saddle, his jaw tightening, his eyes cold steel. He strode forward, the ground trembling under his boots, and the men faltered, their smirks shrinking as they felt the weight of a man who did not jest. The voice of Elias Red Feather lingered on the wind. "I have carried tales where cruelty laughed loud, but louder still was the silence that fell when a man stood against it." The cowboy shrugged off his coat, kneeling at the shore, his voice low but fierce as he extended it toward her. "Come out," he said. "You have nothing to fear while I am here." Her breath caught, shame and hope colliding, and though her legs trembled under the water, she reached for the coat, her fingers brushing the fabric like salvation itself. The men cursed back and away, their game undone, and in that moment the lake that had been her prison turned into the first witness of her rescue. The coat fell heavy across her shoulders as he wrapped it firmly around her, its warmth swallowing the trembling of her body, and for first time since the cruel laughter began, she felt hidden not as prey but as a woman, shielded. The men on the bank shifted uneasily, their grins faltering as the cowboy rose to his full height, broad shoulders framed by the rising dust of his horse. Behind him, "You have had your fun," he said evenly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Now it is over." One of them spat into the dirt, trying to recover his sneer. "She is nothing but an Apache stray. We were just teaching her place." Fury flared hot in her chest, shame twining with rage, but before she could speak, the cowboy dropped his hand to a revolver at his hip, his gaze locked on them with such steady defiance that the air itself seemed to stiffen. "Her place," he said slowly, "is not for you to decide." The voice of Elias Red Feather threaded into the moment like a steady drum beat. The frontier was full of men who thought cruelty was power, but every so often one would appear who understood that true power lay in mercy and in the courage to stand for it. The ringleader barked a laugh to mask unease, but a sound came out cracked thin against the weight of silence. "You would fight us over a squaw." The cowboy narrowed his eyes, his voice low enough that the wind nearly carried it away. "I do not fight over women," he said, drawing the words like iron. "I fight for them." The line struck her harder than the cold water ever had, and her knees weakened beneath the coat he had draped around her, the trembling in her chest shifting from fear to something raw, deeper. The men glanced at one another, the challenge clear, and though one muttered a curse, none dared step forward under the shadow of his gaze. Finally, with forced bravado, the ringleader tossed the scrap of her torn sash into the dirt and spat again. "Keep your prize, cowboy, but she will not thank you for long." Their retreat was clumsy, boots scraping against rock, their cruelty folding into cowardice as they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving only dust and the echo of their mockery behind. She stood rooted on the shore, clutching the coat tighter, her lips trembling as she tried to form the words that burned in her chest, but found only silence. The man beside her had already spoken louder than she ever could. Her legs quivered as she stepped from the water, the coat heavy around her frame, clinging damply to her skin, and shame clutched her throat tighter than the chill ever could. Though the men had fled, their laughter lingered like a scar. Across the morning air she wanted to vanish back beneath the lake, rather than walk barefoot across the rocks. Yet the cowboy stood steady beside her, his horse shifting patiently, as if it too understood the weight of her humiliation. "Come," he said quietly, offering his hand, and though every instinct told her not to trust, her trembling fingers reached out, brushing his calloused palm, and he lifted her lightly into the saddle. As if she weighed no more than breath, the coat slipped wider across her shoulders, covering the last trace of her shame, and she pressed it tighter, her heartbeat hammering with confusion. She whispered almost to herself, "You do not even know me," but he mounted behind. her steady arms guiding the reins, his voice calm. I know enough. The horse moved forward, hooves crunching against stone, carrying them up from the lake shore into the winding trail, where pine shadows swallowed the sound of their departure. The voice of Elias Red Feather lingered over the path like a hushed carried-on wind. I have known rides where silence spoke louder than words, and in that silence two souls began finding one another. She gripped the coat at her throat, trying to still her shivers, though it was not cold now, but the fire being seen so bare and yet not mocked. Why risk yourself, she asked suddenly, the words spilling rough from her lips. They will come back. They always do. His arms shifted just enough to steady her, and the saddle his tone low, but unshaken, because no one should be left in the water alone. Her breath caught, tears burning against her eyes, and she turned her face away toward the trees, unwilling to let him see how his words pierced deeper than cruelty ever had. The coat smelled of leather and smoke to scent his life, and as the trail opened toward a cabin nestled against the hillside, her chest tightened with a question. She could not voice whether this man was stranger's savior or the beginning of something her heart had longed for yet never dared hope. The cabin stood small but solid against the hillside, smoke curling faintly from its chimney, and when he pushed the door open, the scent of cedar and old firewood drifted into the crisp air wrapping her. In a warmth that the lake had stolen, she hesitated on the threshold, her bare feet, raw from stone to coat, clutched tight her body, still quaking with the memory of laughter, but he stepped aside with quiet patience, letting her choose whether to cross. Inside, the single room glowed with the orange light of a hearth, where embers still smoldered, a kettle hanging low, and rough-hewn shelves lined with tin cups and jars of flour. Simple as a man who lived there, she drew in a shaky breath and entered the floor, creaking under her weight, and for the first time since her shame began, she felt the air soften, though she dared not yet trust his promise. He set his hat on a peg, knelt by the fire, and stirred the coals until sparks leapt, throwing shadows across the walls. Sit, he said, not as a command, but as invitation, and she lowered herself slowly to a bench, the coat sliding down her shoulders to reveal the edge of her damp hair, her hands twisted in the fabric, knuckles white, and she whispered they meant to strip me of more than cloth. He looked at her, then, eyes catching the firelight, and his voice came steady, unflinching. A name is not theirs to take. The voice of Elias Red Feather curled gently through the glow like a story carried on smoke. The cruel will steal what they can hold, but no man has hands strong enough to grasp the dignity of a woman who refuses to let it die. She bowed her head, her breath hitching as tears threatened, and for a moment the silence pressed, heavy, broken only by the crack of wood. Then he rose, took a wool blanket from the bed, and laid it beside her, the gesture simple yet as weighty as a stand at the lake. Rest, he said, you will need strength. When they come again, her gaze snapped up, fear tightening her chest. You think they will return. His jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek shadowed by the flicker of fire. Cruelty never ends on its own. He murmured it must be answered. Her fingers gripped the coat tighter, torn between dread and the unspoken promise in his words that she would not have to face that answer alone. They will not stop, she said quietly as he placed another log on the fire, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. Rather than fear, it must be answered. Her fingers gripped the coat tighter, torn between dread and the unspoken promise in his words that she would not have to face that answer alone. Those men were not just drunks looking for sport. They followed someone who wanted more than cruelty. She drew the coat tighter around her chest, her pulse quickening, who she whispered, her lips trembling with the question she dreaded to hear. He turned toward her, eyes shadowed by the flicker of the flames, and his jaw tightened. Jared Claiborne, sheriff's son, thinks he owns this valley. The name struck her like a blow, for she had heard it murmur in the town. Claiborne, a family who claim law by blood their reach long, and their pride cruel. She rose to her feet, panic surging. Then, I am lost, she cried, her voice breaking. If it is his, well, they will hunt me until I crawl. Her knees buckled, but he caught her by the arms, his grip firm, but steady, pull her upright before she fell. You are not lost, he said sharply, eyes blazing not. While I breathed, the voice of Elias Red Feather echoed to the moment like the roll of distant thunder. There are men who wear law like a mask using to wound, and there are others who carry no badge, but wield a truer justice born from mercy and iron will. She stared at him, her breath ragged, the truth of his words warring with the terror clawing at her chest. Why risk yourself against a sheriff's son? She whispered, tears spilling freely. Now his lips pressed into a grim line, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with something deep inside him before he answered. Because I have seen what happens when good men stay silent. My wife paid that price with her life. The words dropped heavy into silence, her gasp sharp as she realized the depth of his scars. He released her arms, gently stepping back, as though bearing his grief had cost him more than any wound. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart breaking with both pity and fear. For now she saw him not as untouchable savior, but as a man bound to the same pain that haunted her. The coat weighed heavier on her shoulders, not as shame, but as a first thread of shared sorrow, and she knew in that moment that their bond had already begun to weave into something neither of them could walk away from. Boots pounded across the wooden boards of the saloon porch as the doors burst open, the raucous laughter inside cutting short when three riders shoved their way in spurs jangling dust. Still clinging to their coats, the cowboy's hand shot to the woman's arm, where she sat beside him at the corner table, her eyes wide as shadows of the men stretched across the floorboards. There she is, one of them crowed, voice thick with liquor and cruelty, the lake girl who needed saving. The room rippled with uneasy chuckles, patrons shifting in their chairs, eager to watch but unwilling to interfere. She gripped his coat tighter around her shoulders, a humiliation washing over her fresh, and her voice cracked, "Please not here." But he rose slowly, his chair scraping loud against the floor, and every eye turned him. His hand rested on the table, steady the veins in his forearm taut as rope enough. He said, voice low but sharp as broken glass. The tallest of Claiborne's men sneered, stepping closer, his pistol swinging loosely at his side. "Sheriff's son says she is fair sport, so unless you think you are above the law," the cowboy moved before the words had finished, his boot striking the floorboards like a hammer as he stepped between her and them. Broad shoulders casting her in shadow, "Law," he growled, "the law you follow is rot, and I will not bow to the voice of Elias Red." Feather coiled to the tense silence, like smoke across dying embers in saloon, where whiskey blurred courage. True bravery was often measured not by who drew first, but by who refused to yield. Gasps rippled as the cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, not yet drawn, but steady, certain. "Tell Jared Claiborne," he said, voice cutting like thunder. "If he wants to break her, he will have to break me first." The word struck the air harder than gunfire. And for a heartbeat, even the gamblers at the back fell still, their cards forgotten. In trembling hands, the Apache woman's breath shook her chest tight, because no man had ever spoken her defense so boldly, and shame wore with something far more dangerous hope. The riders cursed under their breath, retreating a step, unwilling to draw steel against a man who looked as if he had already buried too many foes. One spat near the door, snarling, "Claiborne will hear this." And then they were gone, leaving the saloon heavy with silence, broken only by the hitch of her sob as she realized his fight had become hers too. Her hands trembled so fiercely she nearly tore the seams of the coat as she clutched it tighter, her breath. Uneven tears cutting hot trails down her cheeks while the echoes of their retreat still clung to the saloon walls. "They will not stop," she whispered, voice breaking like dry twigs beneath a boot, and her eyes searched his as though he might already hold the answer. She dreaded men like Claiborne. "Do not forgive shame. He will hunt me until I kneel, until there is nothing left of me but silence." The weight of her confession filled the room, heavier than the scent of whiskey and smoke. And patrons who had once gawked now turned their eyes away, as if the truth of her fear was too much for them to carry. His gaze did not waver. He stepped closer, lowering himself, until his broad frame no longer towered, but steadied, his voice quiet yet unyielding. "Then do not kneel," he said, simply, not to him, not to anyone. A sob broke from her throat, bitter and sharp. "You do not understand. If I stay, they will drag you into their war. You will lose everything like I have." His jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek shadowed by lamplight, and his answer came like iron striking stone. "I have already lost everything that mattered once. I will not let it happen again. Not while I have a choice." The voice of Elias Red feather wove through the silence like a hymn carried in dust. "Love does not chain itself to certainty. It walks into risk and calls it worth." She shook her head, pressing her palm to her chest, where her heart pounded against the coat's fabric as if it might break through. "But I am no gift," she cried. "I am ruin. Any man who stands near me is doomed to fall." His hand lifted, then not to seize, but to hover at her shoulder, steady, offering without demand. "Then leave," he said softly. "If you believe that you can walk away tonight, I will not hold you." Her breath froze, the words striking her harder than any threat, for they were not the change she expected, but freedom itself. Tears blurred her vision, and she turned away, staring at the horse again, the temptation fierce. She imagined the road unspooling before her, empty and endless, free of Claiborne's reach, but also free of the man who stood in front of her, shame, and made it his own. His hand settled lightly at her back, warmed through the coat, and the simple contact steadied her more than words. "Then do not," he said, her heart hammered as the choice crystallized, and for the first time she realized she was not bound to fear any more. The decision was hers, and hers alone. So this is where you've been hiding. Her Jared Claiborne's voice boomed from the yard, sharp and venomous as a whip crack, and the Apache woman froze in the doorway. The coat clutched to her chest as riders fanned out behind him in a half-circle of dust and malice. The cowboy stepped forward without hesitation, his boots striking the porch hard, and the boards groaned under his weight as he planted himself squarely between her and the gathering. Claiborne sat tall in his saddle hat, tipped back, a cruel smile cutting across his face as his eyes raked over her with unashamed possession. "You think you can keep her," he spat, voice dripping with mockery. "She belongs to this town's. Laughter not to you. You cannot wash shame clean with your coat." Her breath hitched, fury surging with the sting of his words. But before she could speak, the cowboy's voice cut sharp and steady. "She does not belong to laughter. She belongs to herself." Gasps rippled as the cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, not yet drawn, but steady certain. The riders cursed under their breath, retreating a step, unwilling to draw steel against a man who looked as if he had already buried too many foes. One spat near the door, snarling, "Claiborne will hear this." And then they were gone, leaving the saloon heavy with silence, broken only by the hitch of her sob as she realized his fight had become hers too. Her hands trembled so fiercely she nearly tore the seams of the coat as she clutched it tighter, her breath. Uneven tears cutting hot trails down her cheeks while the echoes of their retreat still clung to the saloon walls. "They will not stop," she whispered, voice breaking like dry twigs beneath a boot, and her eyes searched his as though he might already hold the answer she dreaded. "Men like Claiborne do not forgive shame. He will hunt me until I kneel, until there is nothing left of me but silence." The yard exhaled, the stillness breaking, and she turned fully toward the cowboy, clutching the coat close, not as a shield, but as a treasure. Her voice trembled, but was steady enough to carry. "You gave me back what they stole." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "No," he said softly, "you carried it all along. I only helped you see it." Her tears spilled free then, but they were warm, cleansing, and as his arms wrapped around her, steady and sure, the coat binding them together, she knew this love would outlast every whisper, every cruelty, every shadow cast across the frontier. For what had begun in water and shame ended in fire, and pride a story that would not die with them, but live in the telling long after the dust had settled. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true heart stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had stood at that lake with only a coat to cover you, would you have hidden in shame or worn it as your pride?